fully vaccinated, twice boosted. This COVID variant, the subvariant, what's your take on the president's positive diagnosis and the Paxlovid that is now being administered?
Yeah, Savannah, 2 points of interest. We know that it's highly likely he's been infected with the BA.5 variant. That's that incredibly infectious variant that's dominating in the United States. Second, there's updated data to show that Paxlovid still works against BA.5, but much less than it does against the other variants. So I think taking all of that into consideration, this is the best course of treatment for someone, not just of his age, but as you mentioned, boosted. I will just say as a side note, most patients with Paxlovid do very well, but there is that report of rebound. Remember, Dr. Fauci had it, where he started Paxlovid, finished his course, and then had symptoms improve and then actually return. So it's incredibly important.
Doctor, what is, when you're a physician treating here, what is the decision when you're looking at, should we do the Paxlovid, which is the therapeutic, the pill that you take, versus the monoclonal antibodies? Are they not as effective against BA.5? How does that decision-making process play out?
Right. You are spot on. The monoclonal antibodies, we used to have a huge kind of panoply of monoclonals we could choose from. The truth is that against BA.5, we really only have one that we can use for treatment. And it also has been reduced in terms of its ability to prevent people from having hospitalizations and deaths. So Paxlovid, for a lot of reasons, including what Peter walked through, you take it twice a day. It's a 5-day course, and then you're done. Much easier unless you have any contraindications. There's some patients that can't take Paxlovid. The president doesn't have any of those. So it is a more obvious choice, especially if you are overall healthy, vaccinated, plus boosted ×2. I am really glad he got that second booster, though, Savannah. It could make all the difference.
Hold there, Dr. Patel. I want to keep the conversation going, but we've just heard from Dr. Jill Biden, who, by the way, the White House reports has tested negative. She's on travel in Detroit and just spoke to reporters, I believe. Let's play it.
My husband tested positive for COVID. I talked to him just a few minutes ago. He's doing fine. He's feeling good. I tested negative this morning. I am going to keep my schedule. I am, according to CDC guidelines, I am keeping masks. And so I'd like to go in and see the program here. Learning loss as an educator means a lot to me. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you for coming over to town.
Thank you.
How are you doing? You must be terribly concerned.
Fine. Thank you.
Dr. Jill Biden, who is got an event in Detroit today addressing the reporters on the news that her husband, President Biden, has tested positive for COVID. She has just mentioned tested negative this morning. That's a live picture. She's now inside that event carrying on, but according to CDC guidelines, because she is a close contact wearing that mask. So we'll continue to watch those pictures. I want to turn to Dr. Patel just on this issue of the BA.5 variant. I think we're assuming that this is the variant that he has. There's no, I don't think any way for us to know right now. But we have noted that when you go back to the March 2020 version of COVID, as we've come along, there's just been a general trend, I think you'd agree, of the virus becoming more contagious, but hopefully less virulent. Is that the case with BA.5?
Yeah, that's the case so far. The data supports that even though this is the most infectious version of COVID we've seen, that it is not more severe. Now, I caveat that, though, Savannah, because that doesn't mean that people all just do fine. In fact, we're seeing people who have been boosted and are hospitalized, especially if they are over the age of 60, which is why it's critical that President Biden receive not just that immediate treatment, but that he will obviously have ongoing monitoring. I have no doubt they will do genetic sequencing to see which variant he has. And if necessary, we do have other things that we can offer him. Luckily, he's feeling fine, relatively speaking, not in the hospital. But we do now finally have some of these treatments to offer. But BA.5, I think it's just another highlight that it's incredibly serious and real, and people need to take any symptoms they have seriously, get tested and get treated.
And Dr. Patel, I mean, we just heard our White House correspondent, Peter Alexander, walking through some of the protocols that are in effect at the White House. And it really speaks to the fact that BA.5 is so contagious because, according to White House protocol, you really can't get near the president without a negative test. But there are breakthrough infections and no system is perfect.
Yeah. And not only that, Savannah, I remind people, a negative test just gives you that moment in time. You can have a negative test, and obviously this is what happened. The president probably had nothing but negative tests surrounding him on his foreign trip, domestically. But obviously, someone can turn positive without even realizing it, because you can be asymptomatic and positive for a period of time. So in this case, contact tracing, trying to figure out kind of where and who might be vulnerable around the president is incredibly important. Testing helps, but it's not the only strategy. That's why Dr. Biden's comment about masking is critical. In this scenario, I would expect everyone on that White House campus to be back in masks if they're going to be near the president.
Yeah, Doctor, stand by as we continue this conversation. I want to go back to the White House. Peter Alexander is there, and I understand you have some information from Dr. Jha, who now is the COVID response coordinator there at the White House.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We just saw Dr. Jha here in the hallways behind the scenes in the upper press, the West Wing area that reporters are able to access, and he tells NBC News that President Biden started his Paxlovid course just now. In his words, the symptoms as he describes them: the president is tired, he has a runny nose and a dry cough. Dr. Jha says that President Biden went to bed last night feeling fine but didn't sleep well and then tested positive this morning. When asked about it, specifically the level of concern, a White House official tells NBC News, quote, very, very low. He feels fine at this time. So it's a little better color about the experience that the president is having personally as it relates to COVID-19. Obviously, those first few days after you test positive can be the most uncomfortable for anybody who's had this virus so far. So it's a good indication that right now his symptoms appear to be, as they describe them, particularly mild. As it relates to Jill Biden, the First Lady, again, you did hear from her just a moment ago, and I've been speaking to her press secretary by text for the last few minutes, and he tells me, as you saw, she was wearing a mask at her event in Detroit today, that Jill Biden, Dr. Jill Biden, the First Lady, is now, according to the CDC guidance, considered a close contact. She is following the guidance when it comes to masking and distancing, but that she will keep her schedule today in Michigan. She's in the Detroit area, and then later today, this afternoon, when she heads to Georgia. So Dr. Jill Biden, a close contact, but she is, at least according to her office right now, going to continue with her schedule as planned. As for the president's schedule going forward, Savannah, as we've been reporting, he will, as best possible, continue to participate. This morning, meeting with some of his aides via Zoom and conducting phone calls with them as well. But obviously, he will be kept in isolation for an extended period of time, at least we believe what would be 5 days.
Real quick, Peter, you walked us through the protocols at the White House, the negative test that's required in order to be in close proximity to the president. Having had a negative test, then were people wearing masks, or I know masks were no longer required, campus-wide at the White House, but what if you were in close proximity to the president?
If you were in close proximity to the president, that's a good question. And I don't know if the rules said that you must wear a mask. Usually when we were around the president, we would wear masks. But frankly, sometimes when you're in close proximity after testing negative, you were no longer required to wear a mask. And I know that individuals had not. Out of an abundance of caution, particularly when we're gathered here in the NBC space, which is quite small, our team and many others do wear masks there, but I don't think there was a specific rule that said you had to wear a mask if you were around the president from any safe distance, having tested negative that day. But I think it is one thing that we'll be watching, is how any of the protocols do change today. I'm guessing we will see several of the president's top aides and advisors, others who have met with him in the course of the last 24, 48, 72 hours, mask up out of an abundance of caution as they sort of continue their schedule over the course of the day. As I speak to you right now, we're exchanging text messages with others who are on campus right now to try to get a better sense of how this will impact their plans throughout this day. But obviously, this throws a wrench into any of the president's travel, fresh off a foreign trip, and we'll continue to work on that.
All right, let me turn back to Dr. Patel. I wanted to ask you what the gestation period is. What's the best information we have now between a positive diagnosis and when COVID is contracted? I mean, it's hard to do the forensics here. Everyone understands it's all highly speculative, but the best knowledge we have now about COVID between when you get it versus when you turn up positive, how long is that time period generally?
Yeah, the average time period has shortened, Savannah. So it can be anywhere from, on average, 48 to 72 hours. So we're talking about exposure likely in the previous 2 to 3 days from when symptoms started. And I do think that they probably started yesterday, just that comment Dr. Jha made about feeling tired, et cetera. So then you go backwards. But we have seen exposures as long as 7 to 10 days. Those are outliers. So I would say this is more likely an exposure. from much closer in time to yesterday when symptoms started. And because he's got such a rigorous testing protocol, obviously that was highly sensitive at catching it the first minute that he exhibited symptoms and was able to take that test and have a positive test. But it's a reminder. I hope the White House personnel, not just around him, but this can spread very quickly, as we've seen with other kind of super spreader events where the president had attended in a previous administration. So this just is a note of caution that everyone should probably wear a mask, even if they test negative.
All right, and we've mentioned that the president is receiving Paxlovid. He took his first dose just now, according to Dr. Jha. Paxlovid is a pill that you take. It's a therapy. It doesn't prevent COVID, but it's something that's supposed to shorten the duration and severity of the symptoms. How effective has it been?
Yeah, the studies show a reduction of hospitalization up to 88% in people who take Paxlovid, who are especially high risk. And those were largely unvaccinated people that those studies were done on. They included some vaccinated people later, and that number comes down. But it is thought, as you mentioned, Savannah, not just to shorten the duration, but it really blocks the replication of the virus. So it's important to take it as early as you can in your diagnosis. Most common side effect, I'm sure some of your colleagues have said this, it tastes like you're sucking on pennies. There's this metallic taste that is just so noxious. It's actually why some of my patients just stop taking the treatment. They can't handle that taste. But it's twice a day, 5 days. Other than that metallic taste and some stomach upset, it's relatively well tolerated. And these are drugs that we've used before in other viral illnesses. We have experience with them.
All right, and I want to turn to Peter Alexander. Peter, I understand a letter from the White House physician is expected soon.
Yep, that's exactly right. We do expect to hear from the president's physician in a matter of moments from now. I keep checking my phone as we speak. It's worth noting that his second booster shot was on March 30th. I want to make sure I get that right. It was on March 30th. But the new information that we're now just learning from the White House is that the press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, will brief reporters here at the White House at some point today. No time has been set. She will be joined by Dr. Ashish Jha, who's obviously become a very familiar face across the country for all of his expertise on this issue. The COVID coordinator here at the White House, and the press secretary and the COVID coordinator expected to brief reporters and the American public at some point over the course of this day. As we have more details on that, we will share them with you as well.
Okay, stay there, Peter. We continue to cover this breaking news story. President Biden contracted COVID. He tested positive this morning. The White House describes his symptoms as mild. Dr. Ashish Jha, who's the COVID coordinator, says he has a dry cough, is feeling run down, but otherwise feeling fine. He is on a course of Paxlovid, which is an antiviral therapy, a drug that you take and that is most effective when taken in the early hours of a diagnosis, as has happened here. So I want to turn to Dr. Natalie Azar. Along with the Paxlovid that has been prescribed, you've got a president who is 79 years old. You also have a system set up where he can be monitored very closely. In that scenario, what would you expect his treating physician, how he would handle these coming days?
Well, absolutely, Savannah. And also just a note about his treatment with the Paxlovid, the president is taking a couple of medications for his chronic health conditions, one of which is a statin, which is a cholesterol-lowering medication that can have an interaction with Paxlovid. And so he will probably be not taking that for the next couple of days. But in terms of monitoring for his symptoms, Savannah, it's kind of what's been drilled into us now for the last 2 years. They're going to be monitoring his oxygen saturation, whether or not he is developing any worsening cough or high fever or shortness of breath that would indicate that what is presumed to right now be an upper respiratory tract infection, that could move down into the lungs and cause pneumonia. Of course, that's the most serious concern in the first couple of days while he's taking the medication.
And I was just talking to Dr. Patel about this, but what is our best information about this subvariant, BA.5, a subvariant of the Omicron variant? And there's a spectrum. And when you go back to the March 2020 version of COVID, and then you had Delta, and then we've had Omicron, where does that fit in on the spectrum in terms of how contagious it is and how severe these symptoms can be?
Right. So certainly it is, Savannah, considered the most transmissible of all of the variants thus far, and particularly of the Omicron subvariant. And because of that, we have seen a commensurate rise in cases and in hospitalizations not nearly with the speed that we saw the original Omicron surge. And that is because we have a significant amount of immunity in the population now with vaccination as well as infection. So that is certainly in everyone's favor, if you will. But to your point, and to discussing why this is significant, is that older age, underlying medical conditions, in spite of the fact that we know that it's more transmissible, but not necessarily more virulent, i.e. causing more severe disease, older populations are still vulnerable. And so we are seeing an increase in the number of deaths, but again, not at the same rate that we were seeing with the original Omicron variant, Savannah.
All right, let me turn back to Peter Alexander. Let's go through the last few days, because we heard from Dr. Patel that generally speaking, the gestation period, the point of infection to when you get a positive test, is generally about 48 to 72 hours, 2 to 3 days. If that were the case here, and we of course can't know that, it would be outside that foreign travel that he just took. So walk us through what he's been doing the last few days, who might have been a close contact, somebody that he had interactions with, and what these days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, have looked like for him.
Yeah, it's a good question, Savannah. To this point, the only confirmed close contact we have is that Dr. Jill Biden, the First Lady, is considered a close contact. Her press secretary sharing that with me just moments ago. Beyond that, we do not know who will officially be determined to be a close contact, but we can give you a sense of what his last several days have looked like. Most notably, the president did travel from here in Washington to Massachusetts yesterday for some remarks he delivered on the state of the climate and some of his infrastructure goals there. And he was met and traveled at times with some of the individuals of the Massachusetts delegation. The senators from that state, Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey, were among those there, as well as some Congress members. I can't say declaratively how close they would have been in their interactions. The entire event took place outside. And then, of course, there's what would have happened on Air Force One, with whom the president would have been visiting in his cabin, or as he was briefed on other events of the course of that day. So those are some of the details that we're going to try to answer. But obviously, each day the president does receive the presidential daily briefing, where he receives the best intelligence that the U.S. has obtained from around the globe. So those individuals who would have provided that information to him, sometimes the National Security Advisor or some of his deputies, would participate in that process. They could have been among those who were with him. We hadn't seen him publicly absent yesterday since Sunday, to the best of my recollection. He arrived back late on Saturday from the Middle East, flying back from Saudi Arabia after meeting with 9 Arab leaders on Friday night, meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. But as you noted, that would have been before that window. And while they were inside, they were unmasked, but also I think what you would view as more than 6 feet away. They were sitting across a wide table. The president also attended church on Sunday afternoon. So I think it's possible, though that was before 72 hours, that some of those individuals could potentially be alerted, or at least be on some heightened state of alert given their proximity to the president. But beyond that, those are the questions we're trying to sort out right now. Again, to this point, the best information we have is that only the First Lady has officially been determined to be a close contact.
And Peter, we just received the letter from the White House. This is from Dr. Kevin O'Connor, who is the physician to the president. So let me just read it, since we're here on air together. This morning, as part of our routine screening program for the president, the SARS-CoV-2 virus was detected by antigen testing. The result was subsequently confirmed via PCR testing. I won't say it all. PCR testing. On questioning, President Biden is currently experiencing mild symptoms, mostly rhinorrhea, or a runny nose, and fatigue with an occasional dry cough, which started yesterday evening. Given that he meets U.S. Food and Drug Administration FDA emergency use authorization for Paxlovid, I have recommended initiating such treatment. We, of course, now know that has happened. It goes on to say the president is fully vaccinated and twice boosted, so I anticipate that he will respond favorably, as most maximally protected patients do. Early use of Paxlovid in this case provides additional protection against severe disease. He will isolate in accordance with CDC recommendations. I will keep your office updated with any changes in his condition. So that was from Dr. O'Connor, the White House physician. The memorandum was to Karine Jean-Pierre, who is, of course, the White House press secretary. But let me go to our doctors. Having heard that, Dr. Patel, the physician makes a good point. If you are vaccinated and you have both boosters, you're going to have a better experience with COVID than you would if you were totally unprotected.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In fact, I think that's why there's even a debate among physicians about whether or not someone would need Paxlovid. Obviously, in this case, the president's age and just the fact that he is such a national security leader, there's no question that this was the right treatment for him. But certainly boosted, vaccinated, and if you were otherwise healthy and younger, we have not necessarily been automatically prescribing Paxlovid. So I think it just reflects that we're in a different time now. A diagnosis of COVID for the president, as you remember with President Trump, was so threatening because we just didn't have much to offer. And now we can actually have some security that the president will do fine. We fully expect him to not only recover, but hopefully be able to contain the spread of this because of the testing, masking, and protocols that are in place.
And immunity from that second booster, we're told, wanes after about 4 months. And just to do the math, he is 9 days short of that because it was March 30th that he received his second booster. So, again, it all kind of tracks. I want to go to Peter Alexander, but I believe we have a soundbite from Speaker Pelosi. Let's roll and hear what she had to say in response to this news.
On my way here, I learned that our president is perhaps diagnosed with COVID. I understand that the symptoms are light. I hope they continue to be so. That was my experience, and I hope that that's the case for the president.
Speaker Pelosi just a few moments ago hearing the news about President Biden's diagnosis, a positive test for COVID-19. He is experiencing some mild symptoms, a runny nose and a dry cough and some fatigue, and he has started a course of Paxlovid. Let's turn to Peter. I know you've got more reaction coming out of Washington now.
Yep, Nancy Pelosi, of course, was one of those who tested positive after visiting with President Biden. She was seen during a bill signing with him several months ago. She tested positive the next day. Remarkably, the president did not get COVID at that time, so it's interesting to hear her experience. Fortunately, her symptoms were quite mild, and she got over it very quickly. We are now hearing from the Senate's top Republican, the Minority Leader Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, who NBC caught up to as he was departing from the Senate chamber just moments ago, asked for any reaction to the president's positive test. He says, "I'm hoping he gets well soon and doesn't have any difficulty getting past it." So that's the latest from Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, the top lawmakers on each side on Capitol Hill right now. Again, the best information we expect to get next will come in the form of a briefing from the press secretary and Dr. Ashish Jha. But to this point, you are now hearing from the president's own doctor and from others who are involved in his medical treatment, Dr. Ashish Jha among them. An effort really from this White House, as they've communicated from the start, to try to be as transparent as possible if there were any positive tests. So we'll continue asking these questions and see what better answers we can continue to get.
All right, Peter, stand by there. We want to bring in former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, who's on the phone with us. And Jen, I know this would be something you're quite familiar with, the protocols and protections that surrounded the president. So bring us up to date. Peter's walked us through it, but we know there to be close in proximity with the president, you had to have a negative COVID test. Would you then have been required to wear a mask if you were going to be, say, in the Oval Office in some indoor setting with the president?
That was typically the protocol, Savannah, and good morning. That was typically the protocol in the White House, in meetings in the White House. But it's important to remember that the president does not only conduct business of being president in the White House. He was recently on a foreign trip. Of course, he does domestic travel where he engages with people in person. And people are not always required to wear masks, of course, when they're attending events or in meetings outside the White House.
Well, you obviously held this position until quite recently as the White House press secretary. We've learned that there's going to be a briefing a little bit later on with the White House press secretary, with Dr. Jha, who's the COVID coordinator, but is also involved in the president's care. Take us inside a moment like this at the White House. What is the number one concern you have as you are giving the American people this diagnosis about their president, that he has contracted COVID?
So then I think there are two big concerns. One is to be as transparent as possible. You don't want to have big mysterious questions hanging out there about how the president is doing, what his health looks like. And that is the reason why I suspect they put out this morning that he's experiencing mild symptoms and that he has begun to take Paxlovid. The second concern is making sure over the coming days, and nobody knows how many days he will test positive, even as he's taking Paxlovid, which should shorten that, but making sure they're showing that he is working. And that is something that they're going to have to plan out for every day, showing him on the phone with congressional leaders, foreign leaders, others, and engaging in the business of doing his job. The White House is set up to do that, but they need to visually show the American public they are doing that. That's not always easy, so I'm certain that's on their minds right now as well.
All right, Jen, stand by. Good to have your perspective, an insider's perspective in this moment. Let me turn back to the doctors. Dr. Patel, as mentioned, the president is 79 years old. We know that COVID has been tougher on the elderly than it has on other populations. However, on the plus side for him, he is vaccinated and twice boosted. The fact that he is showing symptoms, we should be clear, this isn't just a positive test. He is showing symptoms. What do you make of that?
Well, number one, it just reveals like how BA.5, not just more infectious, but we know that the mutations on BA.5 lend itself to actually getting a little lower into the respiratory tract, kind of in the bottom of the lungs, Savannah. So we are seeing people who don't just have kind of a positive test and then they're done. Almost everybody will say, oh, you know what, I did have symptoms. And as we get older, it is much easier for those symptoms to manifest quickly. And I think importantly, I just want to remind people that even though he's had those 4 shots, as you mentioned, the last one was in March, we have memory cell immunity, but we know that with older people, they lose immunity faster than younger adults. So all of those factors combined, we have to keep vigilant. It's why I am very concerned about a trend where we're seeing older people vaccinated, hospitalized to this very point. So early diagnosis and treatment and hopefully prevention around surrounding people is key. And then I think the follow-up, I'm just going to say it, long COVID, we're still seeing so many people vaccinated, boosted, infected, and weeks out having these persistent symptoms. So I think the president is going to be constantly, obviously, checked from a medical standpoint, but want to check in with him, just how he's doing overall and make sure that even months out that he's not feeling symptoms from this.
Let's bring Dr. Azar in on that very subject, because long COVID is a phenomenon that many, many people of any age have reported. What's our best information about that right now?
Well, Savannah, it's obviously an important thing that experts around the country are studying. There's a couple of different what we would refer to as phenotypes of long COVID. That is, some patients present more with the cardiopulmonary, so heart and lung, persistent shortness of breath after infection. Some folks have more significant neurological side effects, such as cognitive fogginess and headaches. And perhaps the most disturbing are folks who really are having symptoms that are quite characteristic of what we know as chronic fatigue syndrome, with this very excruciatingly debilitating fatigue and really inability, to engage in their normal lives, with blood pressure and heart rate dysregulation and so on and so forth. So it's a very heterogeneous condition, if you will. There is not one unifying diagnosis. The CDC has it as symptoms that last for 4 weeks or longer after infection that may come and go. The WHO has a different definition of that. So you can see that the studies are heterogeneous, the definition is heterogeneous, and these patients all the while are suffering quite significantly. I think the best case scenario are individuals who have what we would call a long tail, Savannah. That is a symptom that they had from the beginning that just doesn't get better, but it doesn't impact their daily lives. That, the prevalence of this is anywhere between, 10 and 30%, depending on what study you read.
Yeah, I was just looking at one that said 1 in 5 who've gotten COVID are saying that they are experiencing long COVID. Is there any connection, Dr. Azar, between how virulent, how strong your symptoms are and whether or not you get long COVID? So in other words, is there anything in terms of mild symptoms to give you some hope that perhaps long COVID won't be a problem, or is there no known connection there?
Well, there is. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword on this answer, though, for you, Savannah, because, yes, we do know that if you did have more severe illness, for example, if you were, in the ICU and had a more significant infection initially, that you are more likely to experience some long-term symptoms. But, of course, we all know, and I certainly have these patients who were young and otherwise healthy and living a very full and robust life, who've been quite debilitated by this. So unfortunately, it can happen, to anyone. Yes, we are seeing some, demographic characteristics that point to a greater risk in certain individuals. And certainly vaccination does reduce the risk, mostly by reducing severity of infection and likelihood of infections.
And Dr. Patel, let me get you in on this issue of Paxlovid. We talked about it, I think, a few moments ago. The president has been been administered his first dose of Paxlovid, which is this antiviral therapy, a drug that you take. If you take it in the early days, it's said to reduce the severity and the length of the illness. But as mentioned, there are some who've reported kind of this rebound effect. They feel better,
right,
and then what is it, days or weeks later, it seems to come back. What do we know about that? I mean, is that actually, has it been established, or is that just anecdotal at this point?
No, in the study, they did see approximately 1 to 3% of patients reporting a rebound effect in the studies that Pfizer did and leading to that emergency authorization. But we have a lot more of kind of the real world data, if you will, that shows that there's a higher percentage. I'm sure all of us know somebody who said, yeah, we had that rebound. Dr. Fauci being one of the most prominent cases. In this case, we actually have a very limited option. We're not allowed to prescribe a longer course than 5 days, Savannah. So typically people will take 5 days, feel much better. In fact, they'll test negative on a rapid antigen test. Remember, a PCR will likely be positive for days to weeks. So a rapid antigen being negative is very helpful to show that you've cleared the symptoms and some of the infectious piece. But moving to that, they experienced days later a rebound of symptoms, some saying worse than their original illness. But here's what the most important fact is. We have not seen cases of rebound end up in the hospital. So the drug is still preventing people from hospitalization and death.
I would think that the physicians who were considering whether or not to give him Paxlovid, obviously that cost benefits analysis would have been at the forefront of their minds, and ultimately they decided better to prescribe this.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why, again, because of his age and just the statistics around the infectiousness of BA.5, along with the fact that we're in the middle of a surge, he is someone that is way too important to take a risk with for any reason. So this just was the most obvious treatment. And a reminder that we're limited because monoclonals, as we talked about, are also less effective against BA.5.
All right, Dr. Patel, thank you so much. Dr. Azar as well. We had Jen Psaki, former White House press secretary, and of course, our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. As we close here for the moment, President Biden tested positive for COVID this morning. He reported to his doctors having a dry cough, having a poor night's sleep, and waking up with a runny nose as well. But the White House is describing those symptoms as mild. He's been administered his first course of Paxlovid, which is an antiviral therapy that's supposed to reduce the severity and the length of the illness. The White House says the president will continue to work, though isolated via Zoom. Dr. Jill Biden, a close contact, has tested negative this morning. She is continuing her business wearing a mask, according to CDC guidelines. We will continue to cover this breaking story. This has been an NBC News special report. Much more tonight on Nightly News this evening. I'm Savannah Guthrie. Thank you for being with us.